Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre sleep habits of the Vikings. The Norse seafarers known for raiding monasteries and apparently having very specific ideas about bedtime. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with one of the strangest sleep quirks the Vikings shared with much of medieval Europe: segmented sleep. That's right. The Vikings didn't sleep in one long continuous stretch like most of us do today. Instead, they practiced what historians call first sleep and second sleep. Imagine sleeping for 4 hours, waking up in the middle of the night, doing a few chores, or contemplating your enemies, and then going back to sleep for another 4 hours. That was normal. You didn't have insomnia. You were just culturally appropriate. The first sleep typically started not long after sundown. Vikings would wind down the evening by sharing stories, eating a final meal, and probably arguing over whose turn it was to guard the goats. Then they'd settle in for a few hours of rest. But around midnight, right when modern people would consider the night ruined by waking up, they'd rise again. What did they do with that time? A lot, actually. Some would tend to the fire, or check on livestock. Others would pray, meditate, or sharpen weapons. Which really tells you all you need to know about Viking priorities. According to some sagas, this was also considered an ideal time for intimacy, romantic or otherwise, and while the firelight flickered and the wind howled outside, they'd occupy themselves quietly before easing back into second sleep. Segmented sleep wasn't some random Viking oddity. It was widespread across pre-industrial societies, a natural rhythm influenced by the rising and setting of the sun, not digital clocks and caffeine. In the age before artificial lighting, people's internal clocks leaned into these two-part nights like it was the original factory setting. But let's be honest, it's easy to romanticize this from a distance. In reality, waking up in a dark long house next to 4 other people, 2 chickens, and an axe, probably wasn't the serene, introspective break you think it is. And let's not forget, it was cold. Extremely cold. Getting out of bed at midnight in 9th century Norway was less about circadian rhythm and more about survival anxiety. So, you've woken up at midnight in a smoky Viking longhouse. It's pitch black, except for the dying embers of the fire. Your feet are freezing, your cousin is snoring like a bear choking on a log, and you've got a good hour or two before second sleep kicks in. Now what? Welcome to the midnight interval, that strange waking period between first and second sleep that Vikings filled with an odd mix of chores, rituals, and whatever else they could do quietly enough not to wake the goat. First up, eating. With little refrigeration and zero midnight DoorDash, Vikings often kept dried meats, smoked fish, or leftover stew within reach. Midnight snacks weren't indulgent, they were practical. If you'd spent the evening rowing, farming, or dragging half a deer back through the snow, waking up hungry wasn't unusual. So, they'd stoke the fire, heat a bowl of something, and narrow in the dark like civilized cave people. But food wasn't the only thing on the midnight menu. This quiet time was often used for reflection. Without light pollution, noise, or smartphones, you could sit by the fire and think about life or death, or whether Odin was disappointed in your sword technique. Midnight became a time for private thoughts, prayers, or whispered conversations. Some believed dreams from the first sleep were clearer, like messages from the spirit world. Others may have spent the time worrying about everything they needed to do the next day, which frankly makes Vikings more relatable than we'd like to admit. And then, of course, there's intimacy. Yes, archaeological evidence and medieval writing suggest many couples chose the middle of the night as a prime time for romance. It makes sense. You'd had a few hours to rest. You weren't exhausted yet. And let's be honest, the fire was already going. There's even a suggestion that some people timed their entire procreative schedules around this interval. That's right, Vikings invented the midnight booty call. If there's one thing the Vikings knew, it's that the world didn't pause while you slept. Villages got raided, livestock got stolen, and enemies had an annoying habit of showing up just before dawn. So when it came to sleep, especially in wartime or while traveling, the Vikings didn't just sprawl out and hope for the best. They organized sleep shifts. Yes, even bedtime had a battle strategy. Especially on long ships or in military camps, someone was always awake. It might have been the shipmaster, a trusted warrior, or the guy who lost at dice, but someone had to stay alert, scanning the horizon for enemy sails or making sure the boat didn't drift into a fjord. And if you think modern people complain about night shifts, Imagine keeping watch in freezing rain with nothing but your beard for insulation. These shifts usually ran in cycles. One group slept while another kept watch. Then they'd switch. The result: no one was ever fully rested, but no one got murdered in their sleep, either. It was a compromise Viking style. Even back home, some form of night watch was common. In long houses, those big communal halls where everyone slept together, someone might stay up tending the fire, listening for wolves, or just poking around, to make sure the animals weren't chewing on someone's boots again. And in larger settlements, guards patrolled perimeters or manned lookout towers. But this wasn't just about safety. It was about culture. Being always ready was a point of pride. A Viking man wasn't supposed to sleep like the dead. He was supposed to sleep like a warrior, lightly, suspiciously, and with one hand on an axe. Deep sleep was for people who didn't expect to be attacked by surprise. And while it sounds exhausting, and probably was, this vigilance was part of their identity. To be Viking was to be tough. You slept when you could. You stayed alert when you had to. And if you dozed off during your watch, well, let's just say someone might urinate in your helmet as a lesson. Picture this. It's midnight in a Viking longhouse. There's frost on the windows, a smoky fire in the center, and half a dozen Norsemen curled up under rough woolen blankets. Now look closer. None of them are undressed for sleep. There are no wardrobe changes, no rituals of winding down with cozy robes, because Vikings slept fully clothed, often in the same garments they wore all day, and in some cases, they even added a little something extra like armor. Let's start with the basics. Viking clothing was all about layering: wool tunics, linen undershirts, thick cloaks, and fur when available. These weren't just outfits, they were survival tools. If you stripped down for bed, you were basically asking to wake up with hypothermia. This was Scandinavia, after all, not a cozy Roman villa with floor heating. And while sleeping in your clothes isn't exactly strange by pre-modern standards, the Vikings took it a step further. If you were a warrior, especially while traveling or during times of conflict, you might sleep with a bit of your gear on. Not full chain mail, unless you were extremely hardcore or just had a terrible sense of comfort, but enough to be ready, because, let's face it, the odds of waking up to a raid were non-zero. And fumbling with your pants while someone's breaking down your door with a spear is a quick way to end up in Valhalla. There are sagas that describe warriors dozing with their helmets nearby, weapons at the ready, cloaks still clasped. It wasn't about style. It was about not dying. Comfort was negotiable. Readiness wasn't. And this wasn't limited to warriors. Even regular folks might sleep in their outer garments. During winter months, the idea of putting on warm clothes after waking up simply didn't apply when warmth needed to be trapped and preserved through the night. Taking your shirt off was basically admitting you'd given up. If there's one rule that Viking culture seemed to follow religiously, it was this: never be more than arm's length from a blade, even when sleeping, especially when sleeping. For Vikings, the bed wasn't just a place to rest. It was a potential battlefield. The idea of tucking yourself in without a weapon nearby would have sounded as absurd to them as forgetting to bring your sword to a duel. So whether they were in a longhouse, on a boat, or camping under the stars, weapons were treated like bedtime companions, cold, pointy, and comforting. Sagas and archaeological evidence suggest that many Viking men and some women literally slept with their weapons. This didn't necessarily mean cuddling a sword like a teddy bear, though, to be fair, some of them probably did. More often, weapons were placed under furs, beside bedrolls, or even held in hand. Think of it as security through sharp steel. And this wasn't about bravado. It was practical. Viking homes were often remote, vulnerable, and made of flammable wood. Bandits, rival clans, and wild animals didn't wait for daylight to strike. Being unarmed when startled awake was a quick way to become an epic poem no one remembered the end of. There's even a word for this mindset in Old Norse culture: vigilance. To sleep too deeply was to sleep carelessly. The truly honorable warrior stayed alert even in dreams. If you slept through a break-in or worse, died in your sleep unarmed, good luck getting into Valhalla. Odin was picky. And the weapons themselves, they weren't stashed away in chests or racks. Axes leaned against walls. Swords lay beside pillows. Spears might be wedged under the bed frame if you were fancy enough to have one. A well-rested Viking was one who could go from snoring to swinging in under 5 seconds. Of course, this came with risks. The occasional midnight foot impact, few accidental elbow slices, but to a Viking, that was better than waking up defenseless. Let's get one thing out of the way. The average Viking didn't fall asleep in some romantic fur-draped four-poster bed carved from ancient oak. That's Hollywood, the real story. Unless you were wealthy, noble, or at least high-ranking, your bed was likely a glorified sack of hay, possibly shared. Definitely itchy. For the elite, yes, proper beds existed. Archaeological digs have found bed frames in high-status graves, complete with ornate carvings and decorative hardware. These were the wooden box beds, often seen in museums and fantasy shows. Partially enclosed for warmth, sometimes even with curtains to hold in heat and hold out snoring servants. But for most Vikings, not quite. Common folk slept on the floor, on benches, or on large wooden platforms near the hearth. Softness was relative. A pile of straw moss or wool-stuffed sacks, if you were lucky, and some old boat sails or sheepskins if you weren't. Comfort was not the priority. Warmth and survival were. And don't picture a bedroom. The longhouse was one giant shared space. Kitchen, bedroom, stable, and panic room all in one. At best, beds were built into the walls, wooden ledges where you could lie down, roll up in a fur, and try to ignore your cousin's breath. The closer to the central fire, the better. The elders and sick were often placed near it. Children and animals might be packed in around them, creating a sort of human-to-livestock heat sandwich. Romantic? No. Efficient. Very cleanliness was another issue. You didn't flip your mattress every 6 months. You shook out the straw when it started to smell like goat pee and hoped your fleas stayed on their half of the bed. And still, this was better than sleeping outdoors or on a ship deck, with the wind howling down your tunic. Vikings weren't chasing REM cycles. They were chasing enough warmth to survive the night without waking up with frost on their eyebrows. If you were a Viking of modest means, meaning you didn't own land, livestock, or a suspiciously shiny axe, then odds are you spent a good chunk of your life sleeping on dirt. Not metaphorically, literally. No mattress, no frame, just you, some animal skins, and a nice patch of packed earth that hopefully wasn't damp or covered in goat droppings. Inside longhouses, the floor was usually made of compacted dirt, sometimes sprinkled with straw to soften things up, or more realistically to soak up whatever spilled from animals, soup bowls, or both. Sleeping directly on the floor wasn't a sign of failure. It was normal, functional, low-maintenance, Viking minimalism at its finest. And for the truly poor, this might have been their only option. No benches, no wooden slats, just fur pelts laid down in a spot with good fire access and minimal hoof traffic. There are even accounts of travelers and guests sleeping near the doorway, which in Viking terms was one rung above, outside on the hospitality ladder. Sleeping by the door meant you were welcome, just not that welcome. Also, you were probably the first person to get stabbed if someone broke in, so that was fun. The advantage of sleeping on dirt was heat. Earth retains warmth surprisingly well, especially if you're pressed between 2 other humans and a dog. And when your biggest enemy is freezing to death, you take what you can get. In the summer, it stayed cool, though comfortable is probably a strong word. Survivable might be more accurate. Of course, this style of sleep didn't come with back support. There were no chiropractors in the Viking Age. If you hurt your spine, you walked it off or became a bard. Still, for all its discomfort, this wasn't seen as shameful or sad. In Viking culture, toughness was admired, and luxury was sometimes viewed with suspicion. If you could sleep on the ground and wake up ready to raid a monastery, you were doing just fine. If you value silence, personal space, and separate bedrooms, you may want to skip time traveling to the Viking Age, because for most Norse folk, sleeping was a communal sport. Entire families and sometimes extended families, house, servants, visitors, and the occasional animal, all slept in the same room, and often in the same bed platform. Not for fun, for warmth. Remember, this was medieval Scandinavia. Winters were long, cold, and unforgiving, and fireplaces weren't exactly cranking out modern insulation. So unless you were nobility with your own private box bed, and even then it wasn't that private, you shared whatever sleeping space was available. The closer to the fire, the better. The closer to grandma's snoring mouth, less ideal. Long houses were the Viking version of open-plan living. No interior walls, no cozy nooks, just a central hearth with people arranged like tired sardines on either side. Beds, if you had one, were built into the walls or arranged along benches. Otherwise, you picked a spot on the floor and made it work. If someone rolled into your space during the night, congratulations, you were now friends. Sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort. They reflected status. The heads of the household usually got the warmest, most central positions. Children were packed in wherever they'd fit. Servants and distant cousins got the outer edges, possibly next to the door, the dog, or the family goat. If you woke up with a hoof in your face, well, try not to take it personally. And let's not forget, all of this was happening with zero ventilation. A packed room full of humans, animals, smoke, stew, and the faint musk of wool and wet boots. You didn't sleep through the night. You survived it. Privacy. That was a Roman problem. Vikings didn't need it. In fact, some scholars suggest that this close proximity sleeping encouraged strong social bonds, the kind forged through firelight, shared stories, and the mutual trauma of hearing your uncle mumble Viking poetry in his sleep. If you thought sharing a sleeping platform with your in-laws was rough, imagine throwing a goat into the mix, or a cow, or 3 chickens who absolutely refused to shut up. Welcome to the Viking version of central heating. Sleeping with your livestock. No, this wasn't some quirky rural tradition. This was survival. Viking longhouses were multi-purpose structures, one big room for eating, sleeping, working, storytelling, and yes, sheltering animals. In fact, many longhouses were split into 2 main areas. One for humans, one for livestock. Sometimes there was a raised threshold between them. Sometimes, there was a wooden partition, and sometimes you just accepted that the family sheep was now your bedtime neighbor. Why? Because animals gave off heat, and in Scandinavian winters, every bit counted. A cow could warm up a small corner of a house, just by existing. Several cows, that was practically radiant floor heating. Chickens, less effective, more chaotic, but still helpful. And the animals weren't exactly free roaming through the house. They had stalls or pens, at least in well-built homes, but sounds, smells, and the occasional escape attempt were part of the nightly soundtrack. A gentle lullaby of hoof scraping, snorting, clucking, and maybe the sound of a pig loudly judging your dreams. Cleanliness, as you can guess, was not optimal. Floors were packed earth, straw was everywhere, and the line between kitchen and barn was more of a vague suggestion. But for Viking families, the trade-off was worth it. Stay warm and alive, or stay clean and dead. Easy choice. Sleeping with animals wasn't considered strange. It was a sign that you were doing things right. You were maximizing resources, protecting your animals from theft or cold, and ensuring your children didn't turn into Viking cycles overnight. And of course, kids loved it. Free heat and a living pillow. What more could you want? Let's say you were a Viking on the move, heading out for a quick raid, a long trade expedition, or maybe a casual colonization attempt. That meant one thing: you were sleeping on a boat. And Viking ships weren't exactly luxury liners. Viking longships were sleek, open-end decked vessels powered by sails and rowers designed for speed and terrifying surprise appearances on foreign shores. But comfort not in the budget. There were no cabins, no hammocks, no cozy little berths, just planks, cold, wet planks, and maybe a pile of sails, if someone let you borrow one. Sleep aboard ship was entirely dictated by weather, waves, and watched duty. There was no schedule, just exhaustion. Row for hours, sleep when you can. Sometimes, you'd collapse in your own sweat and sea spray. Other times you'd try to catch a nap while lying next to barrels of dried fish and a guy with a leaky helmet. If it rained, you got wet. If the wind picked up, you braced yourself and tried not to slide into someone's sword. And if you were lucky enough to sleep beneath the sail, congratulations, you just earned the VIP section. Crew members often rotated shifts. Some would steer, some would row, and some would try to get a few moments of rest in the midst of groaning wood and crashing waves. It wasn't restful. It wasn't quiet. It was barely sleep. More like extended blinking. And then there were the smells. Salt water, unwashed bodies, dried meat, and sheep. If you brought livestock along, imagine trying to drift off while someone sharpens a blade behind you and a goat stands over your face. That's not a nightmare. That's Tuesday on a Viking ship. But the Vikings weren't looking for comfort. They were looking for conquest. Sleep on a ship wasn't about rest. It was about survival between storms. Survival between storms. You didn't need to feel refreshed. You just needed to be able to swing an axe when you reached land. For the Vikings, dreams weren't just a side effect of sleep. They were messages. Whispers from the gods, warnings from the dead, and occasionally, psychic spoilers for how your week was about to go. Viking sagas and Edda poetry are full of dream omens. A ship sailing west in a dream. You're going to die soon. Dream of a cold wind blowing through your house. Also, death. Wolves running through the village in your sleep. Definitely death. Basically, if you woke up and remembered anything, it probably meant you should update your will, and maybe not go on that raid tomorrow. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some dreams were seen as visions from Odin or Freya, offering insight into battles, harvests, or hidden treasure. A good dream could elevate your status. A bad one, well, if you were smart, you kept it to yourself. No one wanted to be that guy on the boat who announced he saw everyone drowning in his sleep. Very poor morale. The Vikings even had dream interpreters, people who were considered spiritually attuned and could decipher what your nighttime visions meant. They weren't therapists. They didn't care if you were stressed about goat taxes. They wanted symbols. Ravens, fire, ice, broken swords, three-headed oxmen. The weirder the better. And dreaming about the gods. That was serious business. Dreaming, of Odin in particular, could mean anything from divine favor to imminent slaughter. If he appeared in your dream offering advice, that was great. If he appeared silent, wearing a cloak and walking away, start digging your grave. He was known for being mysterious even in REM sleep. There was also a belief in dreamwalking, the idea that your spirit could leave your body during sleep and travel elsewhere. This meant a lot of people took sleep very seriously. You weren't just snoring. You were possibly off fighting spiritual battles in other realms while your body drooled on a sheepkin. In the end, sleep was never just about rest. It was a portal, a vulnerability, and occasionally a divine appointment. For Vikings, dreams weren't for dreaming. They were for surviving. Most people prepare for sleep by brushing their teeth, changing clothes, and maybe reading a book. Vikings, they sometimes prepared for sleep by putting on armor, just in case it was their last nap before meeting Odin. This wasn't paranoia. It was ritual preparation for battle. On the night before a fight, a raid, or any journey that might end in bloodshed, a Viking warrior might lay down in full gear, chainmail, helmet beside the bed, sword at the ready. Not because it was comfortable, it definitely wasn't, but because they believed the gods respected readiness. To die well and to die ready increased your chances of being chosen by the Valkyries. Sleeping unarmed. That was like showing up to Valhalla in your underpants. Some warriors believed that how you slept the night before battle could determine where your soul ended up. If you were prepared, alert, and mentally already in fight mode, Odin would notice. If you were cozy, drooling on your tunic, and forgot your axe in the other room, well, you might just wake up in hell. The icy afterlife reserved for people who died. You went heroically. A terrible fate for someone who owned 12 axes and bragged about it. The practice wasn't universal. Of course. Not everyone had armor. It was expensive, but even simpler folks sometimes slept in their travel gear or with their weapons in hand the night before a dangerous trip. It was a symbolic statement to the gods and to your crew. I'm ready, let's go. And it wasn't just about death. Sleeping this way also had tactical advantages. If you were ambushed, you didn't have time for a costume change. A fully geared warrior could leap up and fight within seconds. Imagine being the enemy who sneaks into a Viking camp only to find your target already half awake and fully armed. When winter hit Scandinavia, it didn't arrive, it conquered. Snow fell like punishment. The sun went into hiding and the temperature dipped to why is my beard frozen to my chest. During these dark months, Viking activities slowed and sleep increased. Yes, the Vikings may have been early practitioners of a kind of human hibernation. Not the biological kind that bears do, but a seasonal rhythm of extended rest and reduced activity. In short, they slept a lot more in winter. And who could blame them? With limited daylight, icy travel conditions, and little farming to do, there wasn't much incentive to leap out of bed at sunrise. Especially when the sunrise wasn't until 10:30 a.m. Winter became a time of conservation. Conserve energy, conserve food, and try not to freeze solid by February. Sleeping longer during winter wasn't just a comfort, it was strategic. Less movement meant less food burned, and food supplies were precious. Why burn calories, chopping wood when you could just add more layers and sleep through the next blizzard? Many families stayed indoors for days at a time, crowded around the hearth, sharing stories, and heat. It wasn't laziness. It was adaptation. Extended rest also allowed bodies to recover from months of labor, hunting, and war. Think of it as ancient off-season training. If that training involved a lot of snoring and reindeer fur, sagas and folktales from the far north even hint at dream seasons, periods when people felt slow, reflective, even spiritually distant from daily life. It's possible that the Norse viewed winter not just as downtime, but as a mystical season where sleep, dreams, and introspection blurred together. And while some people still needed to stay active, guarding animals, fetching firewood, preparing food, there was definitely a shift. Winter was not the time to launch a raid. It was the time to sleep, plan a raid, and recover from the last one. While most Viking sleep habits were about staying warm, alive, and slightly less stabbed, there were moments when Vikings chose not to sleep at all. And not because of insomnia or goats being weird. Sometimes staying awake all night was intentional, even sacred. Enter ritual wakefulness. Certain Viking traditions and ceremonies involve deliberate sleep deprivation, usually to honor the dead, communicate with the gods, or prepare for something very big and very bloody. For example, during funerals, it was common for mourners to stay awake through the night in vigil, drinking, reciting poetry, and sharing stories of the deceased. Think of it as a cross between a wake and a Norse TED Talk, but with more ale and occasional axe juggling. These overnight gatherings weren't optional. Staying awake showed respect. Falling asleep, that was bad form, like texting during a eulogy, but with a higher risk of being elbowed awake by a drunk cousin. Vigil also had a spiritual edge. The Norse believed that the veil between worlds was thinner at night, especially when someone had just died. Staying awake meant you could feel the presence of the departed, maybe even catch a vision or two. Whether this was divine connection or too much fermented honey, we may never know. Warriors practiced ritual wakefulness before a raid or major battle. A night without sleep could serve as a form of mental sharpening, a time to meditate, focus, or psych yourself up by staring into the fire and thinking about how awesome Valhalla sounds. Some warriors even claimed to receive omens or dreams while still awake, sitting trance-like before combat. And then there were seers and velvers, who sometimes stayed awake all night to perform rituals, chant spells, or interpret dreams others had. They were expected to remain alert still and disturbingly calm while everyone else was nodding off into their bowls of porridge. After all the sagas, ship raids, and stew-fueled storytelling, one truth about Viking sleep becomes clear. It wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. If modern people treat sleep like a wellness activity, the Vikings treated it like one more arena to stay alive in. Everything about their rest was hard-earned. They slept in shifts so nobody got ambushed. They curled up beside fire pits, animals, and relatives because insulation was more valuable than privacy. They wore their clothes, and sometimes their armor into bed because you never knew who or what was coming through the door next. They saw dreams not as random brain static but as potential prophecies. They accepted that sometimes sleep was meant to restore the body, and sometimes it was meant to prepare the soul for death. Even their rituals of wakefulness, staying up all night during funerals or battle vigils, reinforced the idea that sleep was not guaranteed and not something to be taken lightly. For the Norse, every moment of rest had a purpose. Sometimes that purpose was warmth. Sometimes it was readiness. And sometimes it was to prove you were still stronger than the night itself. Comfort, that was for after the raid. After the snow melted, after you made it home with both legs. Maybe, then you'd get a bed, probably still shared, possibly next to a goat. But despite all that, Viking sleep wasn't bleak. It was resilient. They adapted to their brutal environment with raw practicality and a touch of mysticism. They didn't invent bedtime stories, but they sure knew how to turn dreams into legends. And maybe that's the most Viking thing of all. They didn't romanticize sleep. They didn't overthink it. They just did what had to be done. Wrapped in wool, holding an axe, snoring beneath a sagging roof while the wind howled and the world waited for spring. In the year 1480, Rome was a city of incense and blood. Behind the crumbling columns of imperial glory, a new dynasty was rising. Not one of emperors, but of popes who wielded power like warlords. And into This world. On April 18, Lucrezia Borgia was born. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal with ambition sharp enough to draw blood. Her mother, Venata di Catani, a Roman courtesan with connections and cunning. From the very beginning, Lucrezia's life was wrapped in silk and scandal. She wasn't just any illegitimate daughter. She was the illegitimate daughter of a man who would soon become Pope Alexander V, VI, arguably one of the most controversial pontiffs in history. The word nepotism didn't just apply to the Borgias, they practically copyrighted it. Rodrigo Borgia didn't bother hiding his children. On the contrary, he flaunted them, installing them in courts and marriages like chess pieces, pawns in a game, where the Pope held all the power. Lucretia grew up in the Vatican's shadow, educated, fluent in Latin, Greek, and poetry. Her childhood wasn't filled with toys, but with tutors, political rumors, and secret ceremonies. She wasn't meant for innocence. She was being raised to seduce alliances. By the age of 11, the rumors had already started. Whispers that she was more than just a girl, that she was a weapon, a vessel of beauty and manipulation, trained to be married off to the highest bidder or most strategic family. Her father saw her not as a child, but as a key, a way to unlock influence across Italy's fragmented city-states. But here's where things get complicated. Was Lucrezia a scheming enchantress from the beginning? Or was she a girl being groomed by a corrupt family given no other path than the one laid out by her infamous surname? As Lucrezia reached her teenage years, the world around her would darken. Rome was a cesspool of poison, spies, and daggers in the dark. The Borgia name became synonymous with seduction and betrayal, and Lucrezia would become its most enduring and misunderstood symbol. She had no throne, no army, but she had beauty, and that in Renaissance Italy could be just as deadly as any blade. At just 13 years old, Lucrezia Borgia was dressed in gold-trimmed silk and placed before the altar. The man waiting for her, Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, 27 and twice her age. The union was arranged not for love but for leverage. The Sforza family was powerful in northern Italy, and Pope Alexander V, VI wanted alliances as fortresses. Lucrezia, his daughter, was the mortar. The wedding was a spectacle. Fireworks, processions, Roman nobility, pretending not to whisper behind painted fans. But beneath the celebration was tension. Giovanni Sforza was of noble blood, but not powerful enough to be truly useful. And worse, he was starting to seem disposable. Lucia, for her part, tried to play the role. In her teenage years, she was said to be graceful, modest, and deeply pious. She spoke with careful politeness, often quoted the Psalms, and seemed to hold genuine affection for her new husband. But affection didn't matter to the Borgia machine. Within 4 years, Giovanni's value had evaporated. By 1497, the political winds had shifted. The Boer Pope no longer needed the Sforza family, and Giovanni, once celebrated, was now a liability. So the plan was set into motion. Lucrezia was sent to a convent, allegedly to rest. Behind the scenes, Alexander VI moved to annul the marriage on grounds that Giovanni was impotent. Giovanni, humiliated and enraged, struck back with the only weapon he had, scandal. He accused the Pope of trying to dissolve the marriage so he could keep Lucia for himself. The whispers exploded, allegations of incest between father and daughter, between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare. Rome's gossip mills burned with stories too salacious to print, but too delicious to ignore. Lucrezia, still barely 17, was at the center of it all, not as a villain, but as a symbol. Was she the temptress corrupting men from the papal throne downward? Or the victim of a system that used her, then blamed her? When the annulment was finalized, Lucrecia's reputation had already begun to blacken, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. The name Borgia came with a scent of poison, lust, and betrayal. And Lucia, she was only just beginning to understand how trapped she really was. Lucrezia Borgia emerged from her first marriage not as a broken woman, but as a more dangerous one. She had survived political betrayal, public humiliation, and whispers of incest. Yet, as with every chapter in her life, the next would be even darker, more tangled, and harder to explain. Shortly after the annulment of her marriage to Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia took refuge in a convent once again. Only this time, it wasn't just for appearances. It was during this retreat that a mysterious scandal erupted. In 1498, a child was born. A boy listed in Vatican records under circumstances so strange even historians still argue over the truth. The child's name was Giovanni, and two contradictory papal bulls appeared. One declared him the son of Cirbera, Lucrezia's brutal and ambitious brother. The other, marked Secretissimo, or top secret, claimed that the boy was the son of Pope Alexander himself. Neither document mentioned Lucrezia as the mother, but the timing, her disappearance, and the rumors made it clear. Everyone believed that baby was hers. So, who was the father? Sure, the Pope. A secret lover named Pedro Calderon, a Spanish courtier who mysteriously vanished, likely at Chezier's hands. The truth was tangled in lies and vanished documents. But one thing was certain. Lucizia's body had become the property of scandal itself. She couldn't sneeze without Rome assuming it was a calculated move in a Borger plot. If the child was hers, she never officially acknowledged him, but she didn't reject him either. Giovanni would be raised within the papal court. First as a bastard, then as a nephew, and eventually as a tool in family alliances. Lucia moved on, as she always did, smiling through the storms and refusing to explain. This era cemented her legend. Lucrezia, the beautiful poisoner. Lucrezia, the incestuous temptress. Lucrezia, the seductive spider at the center of the papal web. Never mind that there was little proof. Truth had already lost the battle to myth. But far from retreating into shame, she was being prepared for her next mission, a new marriage, a more valuable alliance. And this time, the stakes would not only be political, they would be fatal. Lucizia wasn't just a pawn anymore. She was becoming a queen. In a rare twist of fate, Lucizia's second marriage seemed to offer something she had never known before: love. In 1498, at just 18, she wed Alonso of Aragon, Duke of Bischlier, a handsome, soft-spoken 19-year-old from the Neapolitan royal family. Unlike her first husband, Alonso wasn't a political placeholder. He was a prince of royal blood. And more surprisingly, their marriage seemed warm, even affectionate. For a time, Lucizia bloomed. The court buzzed about her beauty: golden hair, pale skin, eyes that could flicker between innocence and mischief in a breath. She and Alonso were seen walking hand in hand through the Vatican gardens. In 1499, she gave birth to a son named Rodrigo in honor of her father, Pope Alexander VI. It should have been a new beginning, but this was the Bura court. Love didn't last. Power did. Charbouer, Lucizia's brother, now a warlord obsessed with glory, had just married a French princess and aligned himself with France. Naples, Alonso's homeland, had become politically inconvenient. Chezier's ambition needed fewer strings, and Alonso was one. The knives began to circle. Alonso, sensing danger, tried to flee Rome, but was caught. Then came the attack. One night in July 1500, assassins ambushed him on the Vatican steps. He was stabbed multiple times, but miraculously survived. At first, Lucizia, frantic, cared for him personally. She stayed at his bedside, applied bandages with trembling hands, and whispered prayers into the night. For weeks, she nursed him back from the edge, her enemies lurking just outside the door. Then, on August 18th, while she was away, a masked man entered Alonso's room. He was strangled in his bed, likely on Caesar's orders. Lucrezia returned to find him dead, the body already removed. Her grief was real and public. She locked herself in her chamber for days, refusing to eat, speaking to no one. The bright-shade young bride had become a widow and a warning. The message was clear. In the Bura household, affection was weakness, and survival meant knowing when to close your heart. Lucrezia emerged colder, wiser, and much more dangerous. She no longer trusted love. She trusted alliances, and her next marriage would be the grandest and most dangerous of all. In 1501, just months after Alonso's murder, Lucizia Borgia was once again dressed in regal silk and sent north. This time to marry Alonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duce of Ferrara. It was a strategic masterstroke. If the Borgias could tie themselves to one of Italy's most prestigious noble houses, they would no longer be seen as foreign upstarts from Spain. They'd be Italian royalty. But the Este family had their doubts. Alfonso d'Este didn't want to marry a woman whose family name reeked of poison, scandal, and incest. His sister, the brilliant Isabella d'Este, openly called Lucia a harlot. Even Ferrara's ambassadors warned the Duke against accepting this Roman woman. But Pope Alexander VI sweetened the deal with money, land, and military promises. And so, reluctantly, the match was made. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara in 1502 like a queen from another world. Rome was chaos and corruption. Ferrara was refinement and legacy. Here, the nobility prided themselves on courtly etiquette, education, and dignity. Lucrezia knew she was under a microscope. Every gesture, every word, every outfit was judged. But she didn't falter. She adapted quickly. She wore modest gowns, hosted refined gatherings, and earned praise for her charm and intelligence. Ferrara's court, at first icy, began to thaw. Her beauty was undeniable, but more importantly, she brought a magnetic presence, a combination of wit, grace, and resilience forged in the fires of papal politics. Lucrezia also began to cultivate a new image. No longer the Vatican seductress, she positioned herself as a patron of the arts, a loving wife, and most importantly, a duchess worthy of the Este name. Her court attracted poets, artists, and scholars. She funded churches and hospitals. She carried herself with the cool elegance of someone who had seen too much and learned how to survive it. Though her marriage to Alonso d'Este was politically motivated, they found a kind of rhythm, more respect than passion, but far from loveless. Alonso valued her diplomacy. She admired his strength, and over time they would raise several children together. But even as Lucrezia settled into her new role, the shadows of Rome never entirely left her. With her father still Pope and her brother Cesare still conquering Italian cities, the Buia legacy continued to haunt her steps. Ferrara might have offered peace, but Lucrezia knew better than to trust it. In the grand halls of Ferrara, Lucrezia played the beautiful duchess, but her heart remained tethered to Rome, where the mighty Burra dynasty was beginning to crumble. In 1503, her world shifted violently. Her father, Pope Alexander V, the man who had raised her as both daughter and political instrument, suddenly fell ill after a banquet. Within days, he was dead. His body bloated, blackened, and leaking foul fluids. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered that he had been poisoned, possibly by Cesare himself in a botched plot. Others claimed the devil had come to collect a soul too wicked for heaven or hell. Whatever the truth, his death marked the beginning of the end for Boer. Lucrezia received the news with composed sorrow, but she knew what it meant. The leash that had once held her enemies in check had snapped. Worse still, her brother Cesare, once the terror of the Italian peninsula, was ill, weakened by syphilis, and rapidly losing his grip on power. With the new pope uninterested in Buie affairs, Cesare's enemies rallied to destroy him. In Rome, Buie palaces were looted. Loyal allies were executed. Streets once echoing with their triumphs now spat on their memory. Cesare, unable to hold what he had conquered, was forced to flee, and eventually imprisoned. For a brief moment, the once feared house of Buria vanished from the map. And Lucrezia, she did the unthinkable. She remained silent. She did not fight to restore her family. She did not ride south to help Cesare. She closed the gates of Ferrara and focused inward. Many saw it as betrayal, but she knew survival demanded distance. Her power now depended not on the Borgers, but on being a true Este duchess. Her past was poison. Her future had to be clean. Still, she grieved in private. Her letters reveal a woman torn between worlds, mourning her father and brother, yet fearful of what their legacy might do to her children's future. With the collapse of her family, Lucrezia had a choice: cling to the ashes of the past, or build something new from them. She chose the latter. She would no longer be the daughter of the Pope. She would become the duchess who outlived her name. With the fall of the Buia dynasty behind her and the chaos of Rome replaced by the order of Ferrara, Lucrezia Buia began her most surprising transformation. Not into a queen of scandal, but a queen of culture. No longer tethered to Vatican schemes, Lucrezia turned her energy toward building a court unlike any other in northern Italy. She invited humanists, poets, theologians, and artists to Ferrara, transforming the Duce into a glittering beacon of Renaissance thought. Her salons became legendary spaces where philosophy, music, and politics mixed with elegance and a hint of rebellion. She became a patron of the arts, commissioning paintings and plays, and writing poetry of her own. Among those who passed through her orbit were Ariosto and Prombo, two men who captured her wit and beauty in immortal verse. BMBO in particular fell deeply in love with her. Their correspondence filled with longing and literary flair reveals a Lucrezia who was intellectually curious, emotionally complex, and very much in control of her public image. Yet behind the art and refinement was a woman still navigating a dangerous court. Life in Ferrara was not without enemies. Some nobles still whispered that she was a Buier witch in disguise. Others resented her influence over Duke Alonso, but Lucrezia countered their disdain with impeccable diplomacy. She made strategic charitable donations, championed religious causes, and hosted lavish public festivals to win the hearts of her subjects. Motherhood, too, became a new focus. She bore several children, though not all survived infancy, and lavished attention on their education and futures. She was especially protective of her eldest, Rodrigo, whose birth had been shrouded in scandal. In Ferrara, she tried to secure his place with titles and affection, though he remained an uncomfortable reminder of her past life. Perhaps most notably, Lucrezia used her position to mediate between warring Italian factions. She wrote letters to kings and popes offering peace proposals and calming tensions. Some even began to see her not as a former pawn of the papacy, but as a ruler in her own right. By 1510, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer just surviving, she was thriving as a duchess, a mother, a patron, and perhaps finally as her own woman. But peace in Renaissance Italy was always a brief illusion, and the shadows of the past were never truly gone. As the golden glow of Ferrara's Renaissance court shimmered outward within Lucrezia Borgia's private world, darkness returned, quietly, relentlessly. In the years following her cultural triumphs, tragedy struck her family like a slow, choking tide. Her beloved son, Rodrigo, the child, born of her marriage to Alonso of Aragon, died in 1512 at just 13 years old. The boy had been her pride, her living proof that love once existed in her turbulent life. His death shattered her. Friends wrote of her retreating from court. Her bright presence dimmed, her joy hollowed out. She wore mourning clothes for months, and her letters became darker, more fatalistic. But it didn't end there. She would lose multiple children in infancy, tiny lives that barely drew breath before vanishing into prayer books and tombs. Each loss left her body weaker, her spirit more burdened. Still, she endured, keeping her pain tightly wound behind the poised mask of a duchess. Publicly, she smiled at festivals. Privately, she confessed to spiritual torment, guilt, and dread. And then there were the persistent whispers, the stories of her past, the poisoned goblets, the incestuous accusations. The secret baby never truly left her. No matter how many chapels she built or artists she supported, there were always those who muttered Borgia with narrowed eyes. Her efforts at redemption often felt like trying to scrub ink from a parchment. The stain wouldn't leave. Even her marriage to Alonso d'Este, once respectful, if not romantic, grew strained. Alonso was often away on military campaigns, and Lucrezia began to take more interest in religion and mysticism. She fasted frequently, commissioned sacred art, and poured money into monks. Some said she was atoning for sins she never confessed. Others believed she was preparing for something darker. Her health, already weakened by repeated childbirths and stress, began to fail. She suffered from fevers, exhaustion, and melancholia. By 1518, even climbing the stairs became difficult. Yet, through it all, she kept writing, kept mediating, kept protecting her children and preserving the Ferrara court's splendor. It was as if she knew time was running out and she wanted to leave behind something beautiful, something that would outshine the scandals. But history is a jealous scribe, and for Lucrezia Borgia, the final chapter was already being inked. In the winter of 1519, Lucrezia Borgia lay in bed, pale and worn, her strength fading with each breath. She was just 39, but her body bore the weight of more than a dozen pregnancies, years of courtly performance, and the relentless shadow of a family name that never let her go. She had fallen ill after giving birth to her final child, a daughter, who died within hours. The labor had been brutal, and infections set in quickly. Ferrara's finest physicians hovered helplessly, but the Duchess already seemed to know her fate. Her letters turned mournful. She confessed her soul to the heavens. She asked for prayers, not pity. On June 24, 1519, Lucrezia Borgia died. The city of Ferrara mourned deeply. Bells rang across the Duce convents, held vigils, and courtiers wept. The woman who had once been scorned as the Vatican serpent was now mourned as a noble, wise, and compassionate duchess. Alonso d'Este, often distant in life, grieved her sincerely. Her children, especially the ones old enough to understand, remembered her as a devoted mother, gentle, careful, and fiercely protective. But outside Ferrara, the myth reasserted itself. Rome remembered the younger Lucrezia, the girl caught in a web of power, scandal, and whispered poison. Pamphlets and stories revived the old rumors that she had seduced cardinals, murdered husbands, and slept with her brother. Never mind that much of it was political slander. The Borgia brand had long been tainted, and she had carried its burden to the grave. Still, a quieter truth endured. Lusatia had not been a schemer. She had been a survivor, a girl traded like coin by powerful men who eventually learned to shape her own court, culture, and legacy. A woman who turned scandal into strategy and disgrace into dignity. She left behind poems, letters, and architecture, pieces of herself scattered across the Italian Renaissance, and in time, historians would begin to re-examine her story. Was she a villain, a victim, or both? Perhaps she was something rarer, a woman who lived in a time that had no room for her complexity. And in that way, Lucretia Borgia became more than just a daughter of a pope. She became a mirror, reflecting the sins, fears, and brilliance of an age that still hasn't quite forgiven her for surviving it. Richard Plantagenet was born on September 8, 1157, in Oxford into a world of power struggles and dynastic ambition. His father was King Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings, a ruler of terrifying energy and legal genius. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman of unparalleled influence, once Queen of France, then Queen of England, and forever a political storm in her own right. From birth, Richard was not raised to be English. He was raised to be powerful. He grew up not in the mists of Britain, but in the sun-drenched courts of Aquitaine, his mother's duchy in southern France. There he absorbed not just the language and chivalry of the region but its intense pride and martial culture. He preferred speaking Languedoc over English and would always identify more as a French duke than an English prince. Unlike his older brother Henry, the young king, Richard wasn't coddled with ceremony. He was taught to lead armies. By the time he was 12, he was training with knights. By 15, he was already riding in full armor, jousting and studying the military campaigns of Julius Caesar. He was tall, charismatic, and terrifyingly brave. And it was clear early on, this boy wasn't made to sit on thrones. He was made to seize them. But Richard's youth was soaked in family betrayal, his father's paranoia, his mother's ambition, and the bitter rivalries between his brothers created a toxic brew of loyalty and rebellion. In 1173, when Richard was just 16, he joined a rebellion against his own father, led by his mother and elder brother. They claimed Henry was denying them power, titles, and land. It was a bold, dangerous move. Richard, barely out of boyhood, rode into war, not against foreign enemies, but against his own blood. The rebellion failed. Elelonian was imprisoned. Richard was forced to kneel before his father and beg forgiveness, but Henry saw something in him. Fire, audacity, skill. He forgave him, but kept a weary eye. By the time Richard reached adulthood, he had already tasted both rebellion and redemption. He had learned that thrones were never inherited peacefully. They were earned with blood, strategy, and fear. And Richard was just getting started. After the failed rebellion against his father, Richard was given control over Aquitaine, his mother's ancestral duchy, but Aquitaine was no prize. It was a boiling cauldron of noble revolts, feuding princes, and towns that barely respected the authority of the English crown. And Richard, barely a man, was expected to rule it. What he did instead was conquer it. Between 1173 and 1189, Richard transformed from a rebellious prince into a battle-hardened warlord. He crushed insurgents, laid siege to rebellious castles, and personally led his knights into brutal skirmishes. He was merciless. Cities that defied him were burned. Castles were razed. Nobles who dared to rise up were exiled or executed. He ruled Aquitaine, not with charm, but with steel. It was here he earned his legendary epithet, Coeur de Lion, the lion heart. His courage was undeniable. He rode at the front of every charge, fought hand to hand, and was rumored to be the strongest knight in his own court. His ferocity on the battlefield became legend, but so did his temper and vanity. Richard did not forget slights, and he ruled, not as a just king, but as a feared warrior. His relationship with his family only worsened during these years. He and his brothers, Geoffrey and John, vied constantly for their father's approval and territories. And Henry II, seeing Richard's growing ambition, feared him. The new civil war nearly erupted more than once. Then, in 1183, fate took a dramatic turn. Henry the young king, Richard's elder brother and the presumed heir to the English throne, died of dysentery while campaigning. Suddenly, Richard was next in line. but Henry II didn't trust him and tried to force him to hand over Aquitaine to his youngest brother, John. Richard refused. Tensions snapped again. In 1187, Elalania, still imprisoned, was released briefly to mediate. But the final break came in 1189, when Richard did the unthinkable. He allied with King Philip II of France, his father's enemy. Together, they attacked Henry's territories. In France, the aging king, sick, tired, and betrayed by his favorite son, was finally broken. When Henry died shortly after, Richard became King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou, but his crown wasn't forged in Westminster. It was forged in rebellion, fire, and the ashes of a father's broken heart. When Richard I ascended the English throne in 1189, the people celebrated. He was 31, tall, golden-haired, and already a living legend. But they didn't know what they were really getting. Richard wasn't interested in governing. He had no passion for tax reform, justice, or domestic policy. He saw England not as a homeland, but as a bank, because Richard had one obsession: the crusade. He had vowed to take the cross years earlier. Inspired by tales of Jerusalem's fall and the growing fame of Saladin, the great Muslim leader who had reclaimed the Holy City. To Richard, this was not just a war. It was his divine purpose, a chance to prove himself not just as a king, but as a holy warrior, God's chosen champion. So, he sold everything that wasn't nailed down. He drained the royal treasury. He imposed massive taxes. He sold titles, lands, and offices, infamously declaring he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. He even ransomed prisoners and pardoned criminals for coin. The money all went to ships, armor, and mercenaries. In less than a year, he had transformed England into a crusader's launchpad. But England itself, it was left behind. Richard appointed a government in his absence. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as regent, and his ambitious but dangerous brother, John, was left with minimal power. For now, the people hoped Richard would return soon. He wouldn't. In 1190, he departed for the Third Crusade, sailing alongside King Philip of France, his former ally, and soon bitter rival. Together, they stopped in Sicily, where Richard immediately found himself embroiled in a power struggle between local rulers. Instead of praying in cathedrals or fasting in holy silence, he laid siege to the city of Messina and sacked it. He was not there to negotiate. He was there to conquer. This was Richard's pattern: arrive, intimidate, fight, and demand surrender. And it worked. Msc and I submitted. Gold flowed into his coffers. And by the time his fleet set sail again, his reputation as the most dangerous knight in Christendom was sealed, but already cracks were forming. His alliance with Philip was beginning to rot, and storms would soon scatter his fleet. And far to the east, Saladin waited, ready to test the Lionheart's legend. Before Richard could even reach the Holy Land, fate threw him another battlefield. A storm scattered his fleet across the Mediterranean, and one of his ships carrying his sister Joan and his future bride, Baronia of Navarre, was shipwrecked on the island of Cyprus. The local ruler, Isaac Kinos, a rogue Byzantine prince, made a fatal mistake. He refused to release Richard's royal passengers and looted the survivors. That was all the excuse the Lionheart needed. Richard landed on Cyprus with cold fury. Within days, he had conquered the island. It was a swift and brutal campaign. Castles were taken. Isaac was captured and famously bound in chains of silver because Richard had promised not to use iron. The conquest shocked everyone. The Crusader king hadn't even reached the Holy Land, and he had already added an island to his possessions. Amidst this chaos, Richard did something unexpected. He got married. On May 12, 1191, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre in Cyprus. The wedding was splendid, the church decked in silk, with nobles and knights bearing witness. But the marriage was cold from the start. Berengaria was quiet, pious, and politically useful, but she would never be close to Richard's heart. In fact, she would spend most of their married life far away from him. This entire chapter, storm, conquest, and wedding perfectly captured Richard's character. He could pivot from crusader to conqueror to groom in a single month. Always bold, always theatrical, always hungry for action. But while Cyprus fell into his lap, his alliance with Philip of France was falling apart. Philip had grown envious of Richard's fame, his charisma, and perhaps his ability to overshadow him at every turn. Tensions reached a breaking point when Richard refused to marry Philip's sister, Alice, whom he had been betrothed to for years, but allegedly seduced and discarded. Philip, humiliated, returned to France, leaving Richard to face Saladin alone. And Richard didn't mind. He preferred it that way. No rivals, no politics, just war. With Cyprus conquered and his bride safely married, Richard finally turned his fleet toward the shores of the Levant. The Lionheart had arrived in the Holy Land, and the real war was about to begin. By the time Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191, the siege of Acre had already dragged on for nearly 2 years. Crusader forces had surrounded the coastal city, but Saladin's defenders were holding firm. The crusade had stalled, morale was crumbling, and disease stalked the camps. What they needed was a leader who could break the deadlock, and Richard delivered. Despite suffering from scurvy and fever, he immediately took command. With siege towers, crossbowmen, and terrifying discipline, he launched relentless assaults. Within a month, Acre fell. The Muslim defenders surrendered, and the city's gates creaked open. But the real drama began after the surrender. Richard demanded an enormous ransom from Saladin, 200,000 gold dinars, the release of Christian prisoners, and the return of the true cross. A sacred relic taken at the disastrous Battle of Hattin. Saladin hesitated. He stalled. Negotiations dragged. Richard's patience snapped. On August 20, 1191, he ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. They were marched outside the city walls and slaughtered in full view of Saladin's army. The message was unmistakable. Richard would not be played with. He dealt in action, not diplomacy. The massacre sent shockwaves across the Holy Land. Crusaders were stunned. Saladin, known for his chivalry, was enraged, but he did not retaliate with the same brutality. He continued to treat captured Christians with mercy, perhaps to draw contrast with the bloodthirsty Lionheart. The horror at Acre also set the tone for the rest of Richard's campaign. He was both a hero and a terror. 2 Christian knights. He was the embodiment of medieval virtue, fearless, devout, unyielding. To Muslims, he was a beast in human armor. Despite this dark stain, Richard's military genius was undeniable. After Acre, he reorganized the Crusader forces, repaired their fractured morale, and began marching south toward Jaffa, aiming to threaten Jerusalem itself. But Jerusalem was more than a military target. It was a symbol. And while Richard won battles on the ground, he was slowly losing a greater war, one of distance, loyalty, and time. Because back in England and France, his enemies were beginning to move. And the longer he stayed in the east, the more vulnerable his crown became. But Richard didn't care yet. For now, the Lionheart had blood to spill and holy ground to reclaim. With Acre behind him and the road to Jerusalem open, Richard's crusades seemed unstoppable. Victories followed quickly. He won the Battle of Ars in September 1191, defeating Saladin's elite forces with tactical brilliance, while most Crusader leaders would have crumbled under a desert ambush. Richard adapted, flanked, and countercharged with terrifying precision. His command on the battlefield was almost supernatural. He inspired loyalty, fear, and awe in equal measure. By winter, the Crusader army stood within sight of Jerusalem. And yet, Richard hesitated. Taking Jerusalem wasn't just a matter of military strength. It was logistics, supply lines, and weather. The rainy season turned roads into rivers of mud, making siege engines useless. Worse still, Saladin's army shadowed every move, waiting for a mistake. But the real reason for Richard's doubt ran deeper. He knew that even if he took the city, he couldn't hold it. The Crusader states were too fractured, their allies too unreliable, and Richard had no intention of staying in the Holy Land forever. Without reinforcements, Jerusalem would simply fall back into Muslim hands once he left. For a man obsessed with lasting glory, a fleeting conquest wasn't enough. So in early 1192, Richard turned back. It was a decision that stunned his men. They had marched for years, spilled oceans of blood, and come within arm's reach of the holiest city in Christendom, only to retreat. Richard justified it as strategy. Others whispered of cowardice, exhaustion, or perhaps a rare moment of humility. Either way, Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. But the campaign wasn't over. Richard recaptured Jaffa in July 1192 with another daring assault, personally leading a last-minute counterattack to save the city. Saladin was reportedly impressed by his courage, calling him a man of iron. Still, both leaders were exhausted. By September, they agreed to a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, Jerusalem, would stay under Saladin's control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit freely. The Crusader states would retain a thin strip of coast. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Richard had failed to reclaim the Holy City, yet preserved Christian influence in the region. But as he turned to sail home, a new enemy awaited. Not Saladin, but Europe itself. Because while Richard fought for Christendom, his own brother had begun fighting for his crown. Richard the Lionheart never made it straight home from the Holy Land. In fact, he barely made it home at all. In late 1192, he began the long journey back to England. But storm, illness, and political enemies turned that journey into a nightmare. Sailing through the Adriatic Sea, Richard was forced ashore and tried to travel incognito through Central Europe, disguised as a humble pilgrim. It didn't work. He was recognized near Vienna by agents of Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had humiliated during the crusade by tearing down his banner from the walls of Acre. Leopold, nursing that old grudge, arrested the king and passed him along to Emperor Henry V, sixth of the Holy Roman Empire. Richard, warrior king of England, lion of the Crusades, was now a prisoner in a cold German dungeon. The news shocked Europe. Kings weren't supposed to be treated like this. Not unless they were being executed. But Henry V saw an opportunity. He demanded an outrageous ransom, 150,000 marks, more than double England's annual income. To pay it, every church, village, and noble was squeezed dry. England groaned under the weight of taxes, and even royal crown jewels were poured back in England. The real danger wasn't the ransom. It was Prince John, Richard's younger brother, who had been plotting with King Philip of France to seize the throne. John spread rumors that Richard was dead and made moves to take power. Seizing castles, forging alliances, and bribing officials. England stood on the edge of civil war. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's formidable mother, acted swiftly. She rallied loyal nobles, negotiated with the emperor, and kept John contained. When the ransom was finally paid in February 1194, Richard was released to thunderous celebration. Asked what he'd do about John, Richard famously quipped, "I forgive him, and let him wait for my inheritance." It was classic Lionheart, sharp, sardonic, and vengeful beneath the surface. Though he'd only spent 6 months in England during his entire reign, the people still saw him as their heroic king, returned from captivity like a biblical figure. But Richard wasn't back for peace. He was back for war with France. The crusade was over. Now the battlefield would be his own backyard. Richard may have returned to England a free man, but he had no intention of staying there. Within weeks of his release, he crossed the Channel once again, this time not to reclaim holy ground, but to defend his French territories against a familiar foe, King Philip II of France. The two former Crusade allies were now bitter enemies. Philip had schemed with Prince John during Richard's imprisonment, seizing castles and stirring rebellion across Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Richard, humiliated and enraged, launched himself into battle with renewed fury. Between 1194 and 1199, the war consumed the Plantagenet and Capetian realms. Richard waged an almost ceaseless campaign of sieges, raids, and ambushes across France. He personally led his knights into battle, stormed enemy strongholds, and rebuilt castles with astonishing speed. His favorite project, the mighty Gaillard, a fortress in Normandy perched on a cliff over the Seine River, so strong and modern it was said to be impregnable. He poured his genius into it, calling it "my fair daughter," and boasting that he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. This was Richard at his most focused and formidable. No longer chasing relics in Jerusalem, he now waged a deeply personal war to restore the lands his father had ruled and punish the kings who dared defy him. His brother John, meanwhile, was humbled and reconciled with Richard, swearing loyalty in exchange for forgiveness. But the Lionheart was not just fighting France, he was racing time. Years of war, imprisonment, and crusading had aged him. He suffered bouts of fever and exhaustion, but never backed down. In public, he laughed, rode, and drank like a conqueror. In private, his body was failing, and he knew it. Still, the war pushed on. In early 1199, while laying siege to a minor rebel stronghold at Chalais-Chapelle in central France, a petty fortress of little strategic value, Richard, ever bold, removed his helmet and approached the walls on horseback to inspect the defenses. And from that wall, a lone crossbow bolt flew. It struck his shoulder. The wound seemed minor at first, but within days, infections set in. Richard began to burn with fever and his skin blackened. The Lionheart had survived crusades, captivity, and countless battles. But this wound, inflicted by a nameless boy defending a forgotten castle, would be his last. As the infection spread through his body, Richard the Lionheart lay dying in the castle chapel of Shalu-Shabu. He was just 41 years old. A warrior in his prime, brought down not by a mighty army or a legendary foe, but by a single crossbow bolt, fired by a teenage boy defending a trivial fortress. The irony was thick. After years of surviving sieges, crusades, and imperial prisons, Richard's reign ended over a minor rebellion in an unimportant corner of France. It was the perfect end for a king whose life had always defied logic and order. Knowing death was near, Richard prepared himself. He summoned his mother Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, to be by his side. In one of their final conversations, she held his hand. A mother comforting a son who had been forged in steel but was now melting away. He made peace with his brother John, naming him heir, a choice that would haunt England in the coming years. And the boy who shot him, Richard ordered he be spared and given a reward. But after his death, his mercenaries defied the order and flayed the boy alive, a brutal punctuation to a bloody reign. On April 6, 1199, Richard died. His body was divided in death as it had been in life. His heart was buried in Rouen, his brain in Poitiers, and his body laid to rest at Fontainebleau beside his father, Henry II, whom he had once rebelled against and ultimately succeeded. Even in death, he straddled the fractured territories of a crumbling empire. Richard's reign had lasted only 10 years, and he had spent less than 6 months of it in England. He spoke little English, raised heavy taxes, and left the kingdom deeply in debt. Yet despite it all, he was remembered almost immediately as a hero. Why? Because Richard embodied the ideals of medieval kingship: bravery, chivalry, strength, and uncompromising will. His legend grew, exaggerated by chroniclers and poets, painting him not as he was, but as he was needed to be. In the centuries that followed, his tomb became a place of myth, and his name became a byword for courage. Richard the Lionheart was no saint, but he died as he lived, sword drawn, heart blazing, and always riding into the fire. It started with a single woman. On a blisteringly hot morning in July of 1518, in the bustling medieval city of Strasbourg, a woman named Fratre Foss stepped into the street and began to dance. Not to music, not at a festival. She wasn't drunk or celebrating. She simply started to move rhythmically, relentlessly, without smiling, without speaking. Witnesses say she looked distressed, arms flailing, sweat pouring down her face, her shoes slapping the stones as she spun and jerked with unnatural energy. Neighbors watched in confusion. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. But the joke didn't end. She danced for hours, then through the night, and then into the next day. No one could stop her. Her husband pleaded. Clerics watched. Physicians scratched their heads, but she kept going, her eyes wild, her body trembling, her feet blistering. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion, only to get back up and keep dancing. By the third day, a small crowd gathered, not of spectators, but fellow dancers. As if something had taken root in the town's mind. Within a week, dozens had joined her. Men, women, even children, all spinning, leaping, twitching uncontrollably. The square in Strasbourg turned from a marketplace into a dance floor of panic. There was no music, no joy, just bodies trapped in motion. Civic leaders were stunned. This was no festival. These people weren't celebrating. They were suffering. Some were foaming at the mouth. Others screamed prayers as they spun. Many cried for help, yet none could stop. And worst of all, no one understood why. Was it a curse? Was it a sickness? Or something far stranger? Instead of quarantining the dancers, the city council took the opposite approach. They encouraged more dancing, believing the dancers would recover if they simply danced it out. They hired musicians, opened guild halls, and even built a stage. What followed was chaos. The crowd swelled to nearly 100 dancers. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others from strokes or heart attacks. And still the dance went on. The people of Strasbourg had never seen anything like it. They were witnessing a city possessed, not by demons or disease, but by something that had no name, no explanation, and no mercy. Whatever it was that began with Frau Tropha, it had just begun. By the second week of the outbreak, Strasbourg had ceased to function like a normal medieval city. Bakers, blacksmiths, and merchants stopped work just to watch the bizarre procession unfold in the city square. The dancers kept coming, sometimes in small groups, sometimes alone, and none of them could explain what was happening. When asked, they wept. Some claimed they felt invisible hands forcing their limbs to move. Others said their minds were trapped, watching their bodies perform a painful, endless ballet. By now, the local authorities were panicking. Over 100 people had been swept up in the madness. Some were bruised and bleeding. Others had collapsed and been carried away, only to return hours later, feet bandaged, still dancing. The strange affliction showed no signs of slowing. Physicians of the day offered no real comfort. The leading theory, hot blood. According to the medical beliefs of the time, an overheated heart could cause excessive motion and mania. The cure: let the body exhaust itself. So, in an act of chilling irony, city officials hired musicians and professional dancers. They constructed a wooden stage in the square and set up tents to shelter the dancers from the heat. They hoped madly that the solution was more dancing. The result was catastrophic. The music intensified the frenzy. Drummers pounded rhythms that echoed through the streets like war signals. Fiddlers played until their fingers ached. The dancers surged in number and ferocity. Some writhed on the ground as if possessed. Others leaped so violently they dislocated joints or struck their heads on nearby walls. By the third week, people began dying. Accounts speak of heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, and even people dropping dead mid-spin, only to be stepped over by the still-moving crowd. There was no mass grave, no ritual for the fallen, only more music, more sweat, more suffering. Behind the horror, the city's leaders whispered of supernatural causes. Some believed the dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of epilepsy and madness. Others suspected demonic possession, or worse, divine punishment for some unspoken sin festering within Strasbourg. But one thing was clear. This was no longer a strange woman in the street. It was a public crisis, one with no precedent and no end in sight. And still the people danced. As the dancers spun themselves into unconsciousness and death, secular solutions failed. The stage, the music, the dance-it-out approach had only fanned the flames. The people of Strasbourg turned to the only institution left that might make sense of the madness: the church. By August 1518, a month into the plague, local clergy declared the phenomenon a spiritual affliction. Medical theories of hot blood were cast aside. What they now faced, they said, was not a disease of the body, but of the soul. The prevailing theory: the dancers were victims of Saint Vitus' curse. According to medieval belief, Saint Vitus, a 4th-century Christian martyr, had the power to punish sinners with uncontrollable movement. Those who angered him through vanity, blasphemy, or secret sins could be struck with convulsions, trembling, and violent rhythmic spasms. It wasn't a new idea. Earlier outbreaks of similar dancing plagues had been reported in places like Aachen and Metz, but never on this scale, and never with this level of terror. The church's solution was drastic pilgrimage and penance. The city's clergy ordered that the dancers be removed from Many were transported half-conscious to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Savin, carried by cart or slumped over pack animals. Once there, the afflicted were dressed in red shoes, each with a holy cross painted on the sole. They were led around the shrine in ritual circles, prayed over, sprinkled with holy water, and made to place offerings before the saint's relics. A few reportedly recovered. Others collapsed and had to be left behind. Back in Strasbourg, the church ordered a citywide spiritual cleansing. Gambling was banned. Blasphemy punishable by fine. Secular music was prohibited. Public dancing outlawed. Sermons thundered from pulpits, warning of divine wrath. Citizens were urged to confess sins, perform acts of charity, and renounce temptation. The city became a place of hush and fear, as if trying to cover up the noise and frenzy that had overtaken it. And slowly, almost inexplicably, the dancing began to stop. No one declared the end. There was no final waltz, just fewer dances each day, silence returning to the square. And then, as suddenly as it began, the streets of Strasbourg stood still again. But the questions had only just begun. When the dancing finally stopped, Strasbourg didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath because no one understood what had just happened. No invading army, no natural disaster, no visible enemy. And yet hundreds had danced uncontrollably, some until their hearts gave out. The city returned to its routines, But the memory of that summer haunted everyone. Years passed and whispers remained. What if it returned? What if the curse was sleeping, not gone? Centuries later, historians and psychologists began combing through the records. And one theory emerged that seemed to match the madness. Mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. Mass hysteria occurs when a group of people under extreme psychological stress begins to manifest symptoms without any physical cause. In modern terms, it's the mind overrunning the body, multiplied across an entire community. Think fainting, spells in school dormitories, or phantom illnesses spreading in a closed workplace. But in medieval Strasbourg, it may have taken the form of a dance to death. The theory makes sense when you consider the pressure cooker that was 1518. The region had been hammered by famine, plague, and social unrest. People were starving. Dozens of children had recently died in a crop failure. The political and religious landscape was unraveling. The Protestant Reformation loomed, and fear of hellfire was at an all-time high. Add to that the belief in curses, saints, and divine punishment, and you had a society teetering on the edge. So when Fraffa began to dance, people may have seen not just a woman, but a warning, and their minds primed by trauma followed her lead. Supporters of the hysteria theory point to similar outbreaks. Groups of nuns who barked like dogs, towns where people believed they'd been bitten by invisible animals, villages where laughter or screaming became contagious. In each case, there was no toxin, no infection, just shared belief and shared fear. Still, even the mass hysteria theory doesn't explain everything. Why did some people dance until their bodies gave out? Why did only certain towns experience this and not others under equal pressure? It might offer a framework, but not closure, because, as logical as the explanation sounds, Strasbourg in 1518 didn't follow logic. It followed rhythm and madness. For those unconvinced by the mass hysteria explanation, another theory emerged, one rooted in biology rather than psychology. Could the dancing plague have been caused not by fear or superstition, but by poison? Specifically a fungal toxin called ergot. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other grains during warm, damp summers. The exact conditions present in Strasbourg in 1518. When consumed, it produces alkaloid toxins that can trigger vivid hallucinations, convulsions, twitching, and sensations of crawling under the skin. It's chemically similar to LSD, the psychedelic drug synthesized centuries later. And iritism, as the poisoning is called, was well known in medieval Europe. It was often referred to as St. Anani's fire, because of the burning sensations victims experienced in their limbs. Could ergot-tainted bread have sparked the outbreak? At first glance, it fits. The symptoms, jerking limbs, hallucinations, and lack of control, align eerily with the descriptions of the dancers in the idea that entire communities could unknowingly consume contaminated grain and then begin to move erratically in unison sounds plausible, especially in an era when food shortages meant even moldy bread would not go to waste. But the theory has problems. For one, iritism usually causes convulsions and stiffness, not dancing. Victims are more likely to collapse into spasms or suffer seizures, not maintain coordinated rhythmic movement for days. Also, iritism tends to cause gangrene and vomiting long before inducing any form of energetic behavior. There are no contemporary reports of blackened limbs, vomiting blood, or other classic ergot symptoms in Strasbourg. Then there's geography. If ergot-contaminated bread was the cause, why didn't nearby towns eating from the same grain sources experience similar outbreaks? Why was it so specific to Strasbourg? Still, some researchers argue for a combination. Mild ergot poisoning sparking neurological symptoms in a population already pushed to the brink by starvation and fear. Perhaps the fungus dulled inhibition. Perhaps it blurred the line between vision and reality, setting the stage for a psychological wildfire. It's a fascinating idea, a toxin in the daily bread becoming a chemical conductor for communal madness. But like all the theories surrounding the dancing plague, it lacks one thing: certainty. Because whatever tainted Strasbourg that summer, whether mold or mind, it struck with the force of something older, something primal. And it didn't stop with bread. To truly understand the dancing plague, we have to step inside the minds of the people who lived through it. And that means entering a world where fear, faith, and folklore were indistinguishable from fact. In 1518, Europe was not merely struggling with famine and disease, it was spiritually anxious. Life was short, violent, and often inexplicable. The average person believed their suffering came not from bacteria or psychology, but from divine punishment or supernatural wrath. The church dominated every aspect of life. People prayed to saints for rain, for fertility, for healing, and especially for protection, but that devotion came with fear. If saints could heal, they could also curse. And none were more feared in this regard than Saint Vitus. He was the saint most associated with involuntary movement and convulsions. Tales of Saint Vitus's dance had circulated since the Middle Ages. Accounts of people struck by his displeasure, dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed. It was believed he could possess the body, twist it into spasms, and drag the sinner through madness until they were cleansed or dead. So when Frau Tropha began her strange performance in the street, the people of Strasbourg didn't reach for science, they reached for saints and stories, and folklore did the rest. At the time, rumors of spiritual contagion were widespread. It was believed that seeing someone cursed could spread the curse, a kind of medieval psychological contagion. If a single person was afflicted and their community feared the same fate, it could spark a chain reaction, especially in an emotionally frail population. People might have danced not because they were physically compelled, but because their minds, soaked in myth and superstition, convinced them it was happening. The belief was powerful enough to override the body's natural limits. In this view, the dancing wasn't just an expression of fear, it was the fear. Even the city's solution, pilgrimage to St. Vita's shrine, was steeped in this mindset. People believed that by physically reenacting rituals, wearing red shoes, and offering coins, they could reset the curse. And in some cases, it seemed to work. But if belief could cure, it could also harm. In 1518, belief was not optional. It was the framework through which every cough, shadow, and twitch was interpreted. And when belief breaks from reason, reality follows. Strasbourg's dancing plague wasn't an isolated case. It was simply the most infamous. Across medieval Europe, similar outbreaks had been recorded decades, even centuries earlier. The phenomenon had a name long before 1518. People called it the Corarium. One of the earliest known episodes occurred in Aachen in the year 1374, over a century before Strasbourg. In that case, crowds of people reportedly danced through the streets for days. They screamed, hallucinated, and claimed they couldn't control their limbs. Much like Strasbourg, the clergy blamed divine punishment and the afflicted were led to churches for healing rituals. Then there was Metz, Cologne, Utrecht, all cities that saw similar events unfold. Groups of people dancing, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, and often begging for help. Some dropped from exhaustion, others foamed at the mouth. The reactions from authorities were always the same. Pray harder, march them to the nearest shrine, and hope they stopped. The fact that Strasbourg wasn't alone only deepens the mystery. What was this force that could cross generations and borders, slipping into different towns, always with the same eerie rhythm? Some scholars have argued these outbreaks followed patterns. Regions under stress, war, plague, famine, were more likely to be affected, and significantly, the victims were often poor, deeply religious, and isolated from secular education. Their worldview offered few tools for interpreting distress. So, they danced, they twitched, they screamed. There's even a theory that these episodes were a form of cultural protest, a way for powerless people to express suffering in the only language available, spectacle. In a society where speaking out against the church or the ruling class could get you killed, a strange illness might have been the safest way to scream. Of course, no one theory fits them all. Some cases seem linked to air poisoning, others appear to be group panic. A few were probably misidentified, epilepsy or neurological disease. But what binds them is how they were treated, not as medical events, but as moral and spiritual crises. Strasbourg was just the most tragic, most well-documented case, but it wasn't the first, and it may not have been the last. We like to think such madness belongs to the past, that we're too modern for that now. But when fear spreads faster than facts, history has a way of dancing back. The idea of hundreds of people dancing themselves to death sounds almost fictional today. Like a dark fairy tale from a forgotten age. But the truth is, the human mind hasn't changed as much as we think, and the question modern historians and psychologists keep asking is chilling. Could it happen again? Some say it already has. In the 20th and 21st centuries, there have been documented cases of mass psychogenic illness that echoed the stranges of the Strasbourg plague. In 1962, at a boarding school in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, a mysterious outbreak of laughter spread through dozens of students. It wasn't joyful, it was compulsive, uncontrollable, and in some cases, lasted for days. The school had to be shut down. There was no disease, no drug, no poison, just a social contagion. More recently, in 2006, several girls in a high school in New York developed tics, spasms, and verbal outbursts. Panic spread. Parents suspected environmental toxins, mold, vaccines, anything. But after months of investigation, doctors concluded it was mass psychogenic illness, likely sparked by stress, trauma, or even social media exposure. These modern plagues may look different from Strasbourg's frenzy dancers, but the mechanics are eerily similar. Intense stress, shared belief, and the body reacting without a clear cause. What we learn from Strasbourg is not just about the fragility of medieval minds, but the fragility of all minds. Human beings are wired to respond to fear. When the world feels unstable, when systems break down, when authority seems uncertain, our brains look for escape valves. Sometimes that's panic, sometimes it's illness, and sometimes it's dance. The danger today may not be in cobbletown squares, but in digital ones. Online fear spreads in milliseconds. Misinformation moves faster than medieval rumors ever could. One viral video, one false claim, one moment of group panic, and you could see the seeds of a modern hysteria bloom before anyone can stop it. So, while we may never again see villagers collapsing from dance in cathedral courtyards, the psychology of Strasbourg is far from dead. It's just waiting for the right stage, the right audience, and the right spark. And when it comes, the rhythm may sound a little different, but the madness, it'll feel hauntingly familiar. Centuries have passed since the cobblestones of Strasbourg echoed with the desperate footsteps of the dancers. No more stages are built. No musicians are summoned. And yet, the questions remain. Why did they dance? Was it a madness of the mind, a sickness of the blood, or the wrath of a forgotten saint? The dancing plague of 1518 resists a single explanation, because it sits in the shadowy place between history and myth, between science and superstition. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a plague of rats or fleas or fire. It was something far more unnerving, a breakdown in human control. A city watching its people lose mastery over their own bodies, not once but collectively, voluntarily, yet helplessly. There are records, parish notes, city council decrees, eyewitness accounts, and yet all of them are fragments seen through the filter of a time when saints and demons were part of daily vocabulary. We can try to interpret them with modern logic, overlay theories like mass hysteria or moldy bread. But in doing so, we risk flattening the strange truth of what happened. Because maybe the real horror isn't that people danced uncontrollably, but that they believed they had no choice. And perhaps we still carry that same fear. Think of the way panic spreads today, the way fear goes viral. One scream in a crowd can start a stampede. One headline can crash a market. One delusion, well-timed and well-placed, can set an entire population spiraling. We are still vulnerable not to St. Vitus, perhaps, but to the unseen forces of belief, stress, and contagion. Strasbourg becomes more than just a historical curiosity, it becomes a mirror. In that summer of 1518, the dancing eventually stopped.